Welcome to the Allen Press webinar, Publication Ethics, Plagiarism, Misconduct, and Retractions. I'm Tim Cross, Product Marketing Manager at Allen Press, and I'll be your host today. On your screen, you should see some general information about participating in the webinar. I'm going to go over a few of these items very quickly before we get started. Our presenter will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. If you have questions, please use the chat function of WebEx to direct questions to the webinar, which is me, during the presentation. We are using voice-over IP technology to broadcast audio for today's webinar, so please make sure you have the volume turned up on your computer if you're having trouble hearing. Also, be sure if you're joining us on the conference line that you have your phone muted. Voice-over IP quality may vary depending on the network traffic. If you're having any trouble hearing, please call in to listen to the webinar over our conference line. The toll-free telephone number is participant passcode to the conference line or with the next green telephone icon on the slide. If you do call in the conference line, as I said, be sure to mute your telephone. You can continue the conversation with us and your fellow attendees after the webinar using the discussion tab of the Allen Press Facebook page, where you can post a comment, share an idea, or ask a question. Today, Monica Bradford will share best practices for what to do when you suspect ethical misconduct, as well as tips for how to handle retractions. Monica serves as executive editor of Science, the prestigious weekly international journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. In this position, she oversees the science peer review system used to select manuscripts, the copy editing and proofreading process, and the production and manufacture of the print product. Since 1995, Monica has played a major role in the development of science online and online knowledge environments. She is the project administrator for Science Signaling, the signal transduction knowledge environment, which provides a forum for information on how cells talk to each other through chemical signals. Such research is essential for understanding a broad range of biological events, from the development of an embryo to cancer formation. She also administers the Amersham Pharmacia Biotech and Science Prize for young scientists in molecular biology. AP Biotech, a leading global provider of biotechnology systems, products, and services, teamed up with Science to establish the Young Scientist Prize in 1995. Each year, the prize supports molecular biologists in an early stage of their careers. Prior to joining the staff of AAAS and Science in 1989, Monica worked for the Publications Division of the American Chemical Society for 9 years. She holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry from St. Mary's College, Notre Dame, Indiana, and has done graduate work in management at the University of Maryland. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Monica now. Don't forget to use the chat box on the lower right of your screen to send in your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tim. Can you hear me now okay?
I can hear you, yes.
I will go ahead and start. Just one caveat before we begin. First of all, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And for any of you who are participating in the webinar who might have seen my presentation at the Council of Science Editors in May, I want to give you fair warning that some of this will be very redundant with that. And I understand completely if at this point you decide to disconnect. So first of all, though, I thought it would be best to just start with, some discussion of what is misconduct. And the definitions and the discussion that I'm going to provide for you now comes directly from the CSB white paper on promoting integrity in scientific journals. I think they did a pretty good job of capturing this, and so I've gone ahead and taken some of their material. But basically, there's 4 areas that people deal with when they're talking about misconduct, and those are unethical treatment of research subjects, fabrication of data, falsification of data, and plagiarism. Okay, I'm clicking on my button and it's not forwarding. Jim?
Just give me a second, Monica, and I'll see if I can figure out what's going on there.
I'm not getting the, okay, now let's see if it works. There we go, all right. So let's talk a little bit about the definitions of those 4 areas of misconduct. First of all, the area of mistreatment of research subject is not one that I've had as much experience with, but I know for those of you in the biomedical area, this is particularly important. And you can have mistreatment that can be either of a human being as your subject or as, when you're dealing with animals or species. And there are procedures to follow when you're dealing with human subjects, and these are the principles that are included in the Declaration of Helsinki. And also, researchers are expected to seek approval from their internal institutional boards that review these kind of research and to get approval for the research that they intend to do. This is also true that they should, for studies with animals, that they're supposed to follow their institution's recommendations and also international recommendations for the use and care of laboratory animals. Fabrication is when a scientist basically makes up the data. There's nothing there to begin with. It's not real. We're actually dealing with a case like this right now where the scientist at come to light this for over 15 years was creating the data sets that other scientists were analyzing and reporting on and publishing. So it is, fabrication can occur. Falsification, I think, is something we deal with more often, and that's where they're actually altering the research results, trying to make the results more clearly, or not clearly, make the results reflect the answer they were looking for, even if the experiments themselves did not show those results. The other area that I know that has become of a greater interest to a lot of people is the whole area of plagiarism. And plagiarism is a subset of what's defined as piracy. Piracy is basically the appropriation of other scientists' ideas or data or methods without permission or acknowledgement. And plagiarism is when you're using text or figures, images, tables from another scientist or from another paper without permission or acknowledgement. And there is also the issue where an individual can use their own words or their own data, and this is sometimes called self-plagiarism or duplicate publication. But all of these are considered areas of misconduct. So what I would like to talk a bit about a little bit is to give you some just general guidelines for all of these different areas of misconduct, and to remind you that misconduct is when we're dealing with people where scientists have decided to intentionally deceive and misrepresent information, and they have disregarded standards of practice that are established. So the thing that happens now is these kind of allegations of misconduct can come to you from a lot of different sources. It might be that your reviewers make you aware of some concerns. It could be an anonymous tip. It could come from an institution that is doing an investigation. And it could be that you find out that it's being talked about on the blogosphere. So nowadays, compared to when I first started, there's a lot more ways that people can look at other scientists' information thanks to the internet and find some of these discrepancies and these misbehaviors more easily. And you may find that you're going to have allegations coming at you more rapidly than you ever had in the past. So I think it's really important before you have one of these allegations sitting in front of you that as a journal, you develop a procedure or how you're going to handle it. Who's involved at your journal? Is it the editor-in-chief? Is it the editor that handled the paper? Is it your publications board? Is it your managing editor? Who's going to lead the process that you go through to deal with the allegation? I would remind you at this point that a journal cannot be an investigative body. You have responsibilities to decide if the information that you have been provided with at least seems accurate enough and reasonable enough for you to pass it on, to an institution to do an investigation, or if you're having trouble with an institution, to pass it on to a funding body. As you know, both ORI, it's the organization within NIH that is responsible for these kind of investigations, and the Inspector General is the office within the NSF that is involved with looking into misconduct.
Excuse me, Monica. This is Tim. We're having a little bit of audio problem on the conference line. Can you double check that your phone is unmuted?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry about that. Do you need me to go back at all, or do you just want me to keep moving forward?
Oh, keep going. That's fine.
Go forward. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay. So I was just saying that in terms of an allegation, the journal cannot be responsible for doing the investigation to find out if the allegation is true or not. They can only do some basic research to make sure that they are passing on legitimate information to the appropriate source, the appropriate venue, be it the institution itself or the funding body. I think you also need to be prepared to talk about on how you're going to handle confidentiality. If it's a high-profile case that starts to be being discussed either in the blogosphere or in the mainstream press, you need to know, you need to have a policy of how you're going to work with your own press organization, or if you don't have a press group, how much you're willing to reveal, recognizing that you have to protect all the different individuals involved, those who are accused as well as those who supplied the information, your sources. And so sometimes, though it may not feel right, you may not be able to provide as much information as you might like. So it helps to kind of talk this through before you're in that situation to get some guidance from your public affairs office or your press officer, or from even just your association as to what are the basic procedures your association or your publisher follows in these cases. You also have to know what is your threshold for following up on an allegation. As I said, they're going to come to you from all kinds of different sources, or they may come to you from all different sources. We have seen a rise of anonymous tips, shall we say, and that's very difficult when someone's making an allegation and is not willing to come forward and say who they are. And you oftentimes can maybe only pass it on to the institution with acknowledging that you cannot verify that this person is a legitimate source for this information. Sometimes you can engage with the anonymous tip person in a way to get them to provide more information, to be willing to come forward as long as you can protect them. I think, or at least give them some sense that you're going to try to keep them, not allow them to be harmed by being, shall we say, a whistleblower. Again, each organization may want to deal with this differently, and I think it's really important to start talking about that with your editor-in-chief, with your publisher, with your publications board. And then I think also sometimes these are complicated situations where you could be dealing with the need to to evaluate technical allegations as well as somewhat more vague allegations of misconduct relating to behaviors observed or questioned. And sometimes, if it gets very complicated, one or the other you may lose track of one of those two things. And so it's important to make sure that someone who has the skill to handle the technical comments are involved, as well as someone who can look at the bigger ethical questions and making sure that you're actually following up on both aspects thoroughly. In this regard, I would suggest that you take a look at the Committee of Publication Ethics website. They provide a number of flowcharts for different circumstances, different kinds of misconduct. And while you may not find one that exactly matches the situation that you are encountering, you usually can follow their flowcharts to just help you think of questions that you should ask, things you should be concerned about, and different steps to follow. And granted, each situation is very unique. I would highly recommend taking a look at these flowcharts, maybe even using these as a way to discuss with your editor-in-chief, with your publications board, with your staff, how best to prepare and how you would think you would handle some of these situations before they're actually right in front of you. So I would like to say, by no means am I an expert in handling misconduct, and I really don't want to get to be known as someone who's an expert, because that means we've had quite a few problem papers. But to be honest, just to give you an idea of what we've experienced here at Science, we have had 49 retraction notices since 1997, covering 57 papers. Two of these in particular were multiple paper situations. And some of these retractions were from the authors, some were from institutions, and some were editorial retractions where we had to take this step to retract the paper. Not all of these retractions were on the basis of misconduct. Some of them were actual errors, and in those cases, most of those cases, the authors came forward and explained some reason why their paper needed to be retracted, and that's really the much more desirable situation. We have, and so in thinking about it, you have to remember that retraction on the basis of misconduct is when you're really dealing with someone who has intended, their intent was to deceive and to mislead the reviewers, the community, and it's important to remove that information from the literature. Versus where you have an honest error, where again it's important to remove the paper from the literature so that no one builds on it, but it is a very totally different situation than some, a case of misconduct. And you need to make clear in your retractions the reasons for the retractions, so that someone who is doing the right thing and retracting a paper due to honest error is not perceived to have been guilty of misconduct. So the wording of the retraction is very important. If you read on the on most websites, the Council of Science Editor or the Committee of Publication Ethics, they really discourage partial retractions. But I will say that we have had, in a couple cases, and one particular, had to, it was the only way we could move forward with something to notify the scientific community that there was a problem. And so it was somewhat of a compromise, because part of the paper was clearly due to contamination, some of the results. But there's a bigger story unfolding there, but we felt it was really important to get the partial retraction out as fast as we could, in the hopes that eventually, if it turned out to be the case, we could follow up with a full retraction. So the reason I'm pointing that out is that when you read some of these flowcharts, and the instructions seem very clear-cut, but in each case, you're going to need sometimes to use some judgment and discuss options and show a little bit of flexibility, because our primary goal is always to make sure that we're keeping the scientific community aware of the status of the paper and whether or not they should take the time and effort to try to build on that work, or that in fact it is not valid. We've also had 8 editorial expressions of concern, and we use these primarily while an investigation. If we've been notified that a paper is being investigated or a researcher is being investigated, or an author tells us that they have concerns about their work now and they are taking independent steps to try to verify whether or not their concerns are valid. An editorial expression of concern is a way to just put the community on notice that there might be a problem with the paper. And I think the ability to use these really helps a lot, because you can move much more quickly to alert individuals of possible problems without having to wait for a full investigation to be complete and to get everyone just, on the same page with regard to the wording and the signing of a retraction. And as I've already mentioned, so retractions, there's a variety of reasons for them, and authors react very differently with regard to how quickly or how willing they are to take the appropriate steps. So as I said, our preferred method is that the authors retract, and we always try to take that as the first step. If you want to think about this on a spectrum of from good, bad to ugly experiences, the good ones were where the original authors did initiate the retraction and all agreed to retract the paper. We have had cases where one or more authors refused to sign the retraction, and although we say we want all authors to agree to a retraction, we've had cases where we've had to state, author X, Y, and Z have not agreed to retract the paper. And in cases like that, we do have them sign off something that says they were given the opportunity to retract and they chose not to, so that we have that covered. And then, unfortunately, we've had cases where, despite institutional findings that there has been misconduct and the paper is invalid, we have authors that are unwilling to acknowledge that, willing to accept their responsibility for what they did, and in some cases where the institution will tell us that there's a problem, but they're not willing to author the retraction themselves. And those are the cases where we've had to have editorial retractions. And it's also very difficult because oftentimes the authors want to add information into the wording of retraction that sort of still leaves the community wondering what's really going on. And so that's also a difficulty when you want to be as clear as possible in those situations. And we've had trouble with authors in that in some cases because it's their careers and they're trying to hold on to whatever they can. But unfortunately, we have to focus on making sure it's clear to the other scientists. So I'm going to quickly just take an example, probably our most high-profile retraction example, just to tell you what happened with us and give you some ideas of the steps we took after that horrible experience and what we learned from it. So basically, I'm sure most of you remember, or maybe you don't, but we published 2 papers, one in 2004 and one in 2005, about showing evidence of pluripotent human embryonic stem cell line. And this was huge news. We had a huge press conference at our annual meeting. Everyone was really excited. The field was excited. This is something people have been waiting for. There were huge ethical questions as to whether or not scientists should be doing this. So on many fronts, these papers received a lot of attention, both from policy, individuals, ethics, researchers, scientists. Everyone was, really talking about it. So when it came to light that these papers were potentially fraudulent, it was a real hard time. And this is a case where actually the information came out on the web first. I mean, there were scientists who were looking at the information, comparing the data in the figures, and seeing that things were actually falsified and fabricated. You could tell where things had been moved and changed. And there were multiple issues over time that came to light with these papers. As I said, the data was falsified and fabricated. As soon as the paper came under scrutiny and an investigation began at the institutions in Korea, many of the authors, the high-profile scientists in Korea, claimed to have never really seen the paper, not to have done the work, despite the fact that no one came forward, when they were getting good press to say that they weren't part of the work. There were questionable IRB processes, and there was questionable documentation for informed consent. So in this case, we actually pretty much managed to hit on almost every one of the types of misconduct we've already talked about today. And the complexity, this is a case where I wanted to show you because it shows that sometimes just following the flowcharts, while they can give you guidance, may not be able to help you through everything. And some of these, hopefully that you won't have one paper that has all these different kinds of things happening at once, but I just wanted to make you aware, beyond just the straightforward misconduct and evidence that you see maybe in the images and the figures, there's all kinds of other things that can add complexity to your situation. Particularly if you have multiple institutions from multiple countries, not everyone has the same standards for how you go about investigating misconduct. So you could be working with different institutional processes, some going from everywhere from where they really don't have a process in place at all, and you sort of have to try to help them through it, to some that have very efficient, very well articulated and easily found processes. You can go to their website and you can find out what the institution does in cases of misconduct. Again, the anonymous whistleblowers, how you deal with that, particularly when you have authors saying that it's not true and you don't know who you're getting the information from. But in this day and age, to just, say, well, there's no identity on this, and therefore I'm not going to act upon it, is really not an option. You need to kind of figure out, is there any way to validate what is being said? Is there any way to learn more about the whistleblowers? Language barriers are also very difficult because in the beginning, I can tell you in this case, we weren't sure if some of the misunderstanding was really due to editing changes because of language differences. Where did the faults really lie? It turned out in the end that really wasn't the case. But when you are dealing with people with researchers for who English is not their first language, it can be difficult. And you want to be fair, so you have to consider those things. I think the blogosphere and the intense media scrutiny makes it very difficult. There's constant pressure on the journal to respond and to say, why they're doing what they're doing. How come they're not moving more quickly? Isn't it clear? Why don't you just retract the paper? And I think it's really important to remember that this has to be a fair process, and so you need to take the steps and follow the steps that you've laid out in your process when you're in a calm, easy moment to make sure that you are being fair to all parties. And so in that case, you need to sometimes be willing to you have to be as transparent as you can be with the media, and so that they know that you're taking steps, that you're doing things. But you can't allow that pressure to make you jump to conclusions or move unfairly. So it's a very hard balance to get right. And then the other thing is sometimes these become very complicated by just the human element. And these are scientists who have been caught doing or been accused of doing something wrong. And we've had many cases where the individual is not able to withstand the scrutiny very well, and we've had hospitalizations, we've had suicide attempts. And based on the cultural norms from where they are, the pressure can be extreme. And whether or not they're able to speak up against a more junior researcher may have difficulty because of the cultural norms in what they can or can't say or do. And you have to figure out a way to work with all the authors on the paper, no matter what their level is. But there's definitely power differences, there's career concerns, and all these things come to play as you're trying to remember that the ultimate goal is to inform the scientific community as to whether or not this research can be built upon or whether or not it has to be retracted. And hopefully most of you won't have these kind of high profile or these kind of problems. But I did want to just bring out some of these different things that played a role in the Juan case, because you may have just one of them may complicate one of your misconduct investigations, and I think it's good to be aware of them and to kind of think ahead so that you can be more proactive. As we went through this process, at the end of it, during the whole process, we actually created a website, a page within our science website, where we posted information so that there could be as much transparency as possible. I think that went a long way to helping us be able to follow the steps we wanted to follow and to be as fair as possible. And that there's now also a record. So I would welcome you. Feel free to go and look at any of the things that we did there. You can see the editorial material we published at the time. You can see we actually did move forward with an internal and an external review of how we handled this situation and what we've learned from it. Those are posted at the website. You're welcome to go, the committee report, to go read it and see, it might help you think through some things as well. I think the important thing we learned was that a lot of the information that turned out to be the smoking gun, shall we say, was included in the online data, the supporting online data. All of a sudden, other scientists had more data in front of them to compare, and it was that ability to compare across a larger data set where they began to see the inconsistencies, the potential fabrication. And so I think right now it's a huge issue as to whether or not supporting online data or supplementing material, whatever you call it, is being scrutinized well enough during the review process. And how can you improve the review of the supplemental material? How can you control the volume of the supplemental material so that it is able to be reviewed and looked at, and also just to realize that it's an important part of the paper and you need to treat it seriously. We also talked about whether or not there were risk factors that would have helped us identify papers in advance, in the sense that, to make sure that we really gave them very thorough peer review. before we publish them. And while you don't want to sound like you're profiling papers, that's a really bad idea. At the same time, I think it is a decision-making process, and the more thorough you can be, and the more aware of potential risks, I think the better the outcome will be. And some of the ones that we identify, and these may not be true for your journals, depending on the scope of your journal. But for us, we found that multidisciplinary papers are very hard to review. You're getting specialists from different areas to look at them. They can give you conflicting advice, and it's really important in those papers that you make sure that you are getting enough reviewers so that you're covering all the different disciplinary areas, particularly when it comes to a variety of techniques. It could be the first time that a physical science technique is being applied to a biology question. And so for the physical science reviewers, or the chemical reviewers, or whoever it is, they may be able to provide some insight about the technique that may not be as obvious to the biologists. And biologists might realize, they're just going to point out different things to you. I don't think I need to belabor that. So it's really important to be careful in that kind of paper that you get a thorough review. One of the things that we found out too is if your reviews are saying, wow, that result, that data are too good to be believed, or wow, everybody had hoped for this answer, and boom, here we have it. If you kind of start picking up some sense of that, it might be worth getting another review or asking some of the harder questions. Again, as I said, multiple labs in multiple countries. We're finding that sometimes the work in a paper is very compartmentalized, and there's few authors in the paper who are actually seeing everything, and they're not able to, in a sense, provide a double check on each other, so they may not even understand the technique that one lab is doing as thoroughly as they would need to be able to pick up on anything that was potentially misconduct. And then the other thing is if you ask, your reviewers ask for some serious experiments, and all of a sudden you get really fast turnaround on everything every time you ask, and it all looks just right. These are the kind of things just to sort of keep a close look on. These papers did have an impact on our policy, and the reason I'm pointing this out to you is I think sometimes it's better if you can figure out how to be proactive than to be in the situation we have been on these papers where you're having to retract. So as I said, with the Wong paper, we had all these authors who all of a sudden claimed not to have been authors on the paper. So we now, when a paper is submitted, we email a message to every co-author notifying that their name is on this paper and saying, if you have not seen this paper, you've not approved this paper, you need to notify us now. So at least we have a record of that people have been notified, and hopefully they will take that seriously. We also have created new author forms that are signed prior to acceptance by all authors. We used to have just one author, the corresponding author, was able to kind of vouch for all the other authors, and we no longer allow that. And we also require that a senior author take responsibility for each data set. So, and I will show you these forms. And then the other thing, unfortunately, we are screening all manuscripts for image manipulation. I think if you're interested in that, Journal of Cell Biology has published a lot of information on how to go about that using Photoshop, and they're a really good resource on telling you, what you're looking for when you're screening. You'll notice that I don't have anything on here about plagiarism. Plagiarism was not a factor in this particular paper, and so far we have not instituted steps to look for plagiarism proactively. We do not use cross-check. Though I recognize, we have discussed it. I recognize that for a lot of journals, plagiarism is probably as large a problem as image manipulation. I would say image manipulation for us has been the largest issue so far. When thinking about using a software like cross-check, you just need to figure out, how you're going to decide where to set your threshold. You need to decide how much resources you can put towards that effort, and you need to figure out how you're going to deal with self-plagiarism, different things like that. So while probably some of you online were hoping I could give you some more guidance in that, I have to say stay tuned because we ourselves have not yet implemented any proactive efforts with regard to plagiarism. But anyway, this is just also, I'm showing you now our new authorship forms. We have a definition of what authorship is, and then we go into a form where they actually have to indicate their level of participation for a number of different types of activities. And this is just helping us actually, after the fact, if we do have an accusation of misconduct, being able to go back to these forms is helpful to the institution as to what was said when the paper was originally submitted as to who did what. And it also is just another check. If all of a sudden, the numbers just don't quite make sense. You're not expecting everything to, you're not looking for a specific number that it adds up to. But if you start to see that some area has not been, it doesn't look like there's been much oversight or involvement, or there's been ridiculous involvement by one person and no involvement by others, they're just things you can kind of follow up on. And this is the form where the senior author has to say that, my lab was responsible for this data and say specifically that they have personally checked that data. This was something that we were introduced because Dr. Alberts, our editor-in-chief, felt that sometimes he was hoping that it would help the discussion within the lab, that a PI would have a reason to make sure they saw the original data versus it seeming like they were questioning the honesty. I mean, I think what we're seeing is that in a lot of labs, by the time the PI is seeing the data, it's actually, very easy. It's digital to begin with. It's cleaned up a little bit. And this is requiring the senior author to have that discussion with whoever did the work, about its, to make sure that it is accurate and has not been inappropriately beautified or inappropriately displayed. So I would say the lessons we learned from all this is that you need to balance the notice to your reviewers with a fair process. And in that I would remind the journals that we really cannot be the investigator. We don't have access in most cases to the information that would allow us to determine who did what. And in cases of falsification or fabrication, we don't have access to answer those questions, but it is our responsibility to make sure that the institution is notified and that you continue to follow up with the institution, that you don't just sort of notify them and then you forget about it. You need to kind of stay on top of them, finding out where they are with the process. And as I said earlier, the editorial expression of concern is sort of your kind of way to notify the readership to be on watch for a potential problem with the paper. Again, it's not always clear who the good guys are. These situations, there's a lot of, you're hearing from different sources, and now you have these rapid online reactions. And some, like in the blogosphere, we had a paper on arsenic, and it was immediately, it was all over the blogosphere. And some of the comments were very helpful for us to figure out what needed to be looked at with that paper. But other of them made sort of, very strong accusations with little or no grounding for those accusations. And so you have to be very careful in how you balance that kind of information. The other thing that I've learned from this is that oftentimes people are not willing to put in writing what they might tell you over the phone. And granted, eventually you have to get information in writing, but sometimes just picking up the phone, that old-fashioned way of communicating, and just talking to someone, you can learn a lot. Or if you have an anonymous informant, encouraging them to call you directly. You can then sometimes get a better sense. You learn a lot from that, and that way they're making the call to you, but you begin a dialogue. I think that is usually very helpful. And I think when you're talking to the authors involved or the institution involved, if you can sort of at least develop a sense of trust in that you are not there to be the prosecutor, you're not there to judge, you are there to get to the correct information so that you can inform the readership of what the situation is. And so trying to keep that kind of tone I have found has been very useful. And in some of the more complex situations, we have found it very useful just to talk to other editors who maybe also have papers from the authors to try to work in sort of a coordinated effort and a coordinated information release, I think is very useful and very helpful. And also then you can talk through the steps you're taking, while maintaining whatever confidentiality is required, but you can kind of get a sense of ground truthing of, are you missing something? Are you taking the right steps? And particularly when you're dealing with other countries, sometimes you need to find someone who knows more about the system in that country, someone within your, perhaps, leadership of your membership, or someone who's served on committees with your publications that might be able to point you in the right direction for that particular country, who can give you straight answers about the status of investigations or of reports that you're getting through the press. I just added here, this is just an example of an editorial expression of concern. Just to give you, I don't need to dwell on these, I just included an editorial expression of concern and then a retraction, just to give you an idea of the wording. The first one was the notice that this paper is being investigated. The second one was saying, okay, the investigation is complete. We've been told that the data, results, and conclusion are not reliable, and we retracted the paper because in this case, the institution was not, and the author were not willing to do it. It just sort of felt it was our responsibility, and this is how we handled it. So for closing thoughts, I would just say that I think there's a lot of pressures on scientists right now. Funding is tight. I think we're seeing somewhat of an increase in inappropriate behavior, some of which are just poor training. I mean, they're, beautifying images beyond what is, ethically appropriate, but not always realizing that that was inappropriate. Sometimes it's a student, a grad student. So, trying to figure out the intent. There are other cases where people are intentionally and maliciously, perhaps, misleading individuals. But I think there's a lot going on, and I hope that the scientific community can kind of figure out ways to deal with those pressures and to put in place processes and standards so that these retractions are not ending up in our lap as a journal and the editors, so that hopefully things can be caught sooner or can, just not happen as often. But again, scientists are human, and I think that means that we will always be confronted with challenges to integrity. As I said, some of these will be intentional, some of these will be honest error. But I think as a journal, our responsibility is to recognize that this is happening and to take steps to deal with it quickly, appropriately, and fairly. And in this case, I would say, in terms of proactivity, keep in touch with your community, with the scientists that submit to your paper, that review for you. Open a dialogue. What behaviors, trends are they seeing in the field that worry them? Either more broadly or within a set of papers or in a lab. Try to get a sense of how you can be proactive. Are things starting to happen that if you just change some of your policies and procedures, then you'll make it clear to your authors that that's unacceptable and this is what they need to do. And so it's very important that you publish in your guide to authors how you deal with misconduct, what you consider misconduct, what is acceptable or not acceptable with regard to how they present their gels or their images. I think transparency and clear processes will help you most in handling these situations as they arise. So I don't know if that's what you're hoping to hear, or so I'd be happy to answer any questions related to more specifics that you're interested in.
Thank you, Monica, for that excellent presentation. We do actually have a few questions, and we'll go through those now. So the first question is, have you discovered cases on insider trading where someone uses another's data without permission?
We have not discovered that. We do, with regard, we have a press packet, which I don't know if how many of you online have that, and we work very carefully to make sure the information in the press packet is going to journalists that are covering the science and not getting in the hands prematurely of the business or the trade process. That has been one area we worried about it. But we have not actually come across a case of an accusation or evidence of insider trading, either by scientists or by journalists. That's not to say it doesn't happen, but we have not had evidence of it.
Great. We have another, this is an interesting question. Have you received tips from an anonymous tipster calling him or herself Claire Francis? We have received many obliquely worded accusations from this person concerning plagiarism and duplicate publication of figures seemingly discovered through plagiarism software and not considered thoughtfully or presented rationally. It appears that this person's goal is retractions now. Do you have advice on handling this particular tipster?
We have not received any tips from that particular tipster. I think if what I understand the question, so the journal's review of these tips leads them to believe that they're not warranted, that it's just sort of like this person's side hobby or whatever. I think I would probably try to provide feedback to the tipsters on why you were not acting on their information and why you felt that it wasn't appropriate. Without knowing a little bit more about what they're showing or saying, it's a little bit hard to say, but I think that's all I would say at this point.
Okay. Let's see. Have you ever investigated and found the authors to actually have had integrity?
You know what? We don't do investigations, but we did have a case recently that I felt the authors behaved really well. The first author's name was Sebastiani, and it was a case where as soon as we published the paper, we started getting, there were reports in the blogosphere, and some reporters reported on the chip that they had used. It was a GWAS study. The chip that they had used was known for having problems. Well, our authors actually did not know about the problem, and I think the problem was really primarily known by like the first earliest users of this technology who were in the much larger, well-funded labs. And this is a case where the technology was now moving more broadly into other labs. So these authors immediately said, we weren't aware, we will go back. There were some questions also about the statistical treatment that then came out. They really went back and redid the work, so we put out an editorial statement of concern. They went back, we gave them a certain amount of time to redo their experiments. They came back and they showed us, they gave us the results. We had them reviewed. The problem was that they did show an effect, but this effect was no longer as strong, and it didn't meet some of the other requirements that we would have had to accept it initially. So we went back to them and said, this is really not a science paper with this result. And they accepted that ruling and they retracted the paper. And throughout the whole thing, they behaved really well.
Okay, if someone is discovered to have duplicated their publication or committed plagiarism, are they banned from further publication in your journal?
As I said, we haven't really had that, but yes, they probably would get some sort of sanction. Whether it be, sometimes it might have a time limit on it. It might be 5 years, or it might be completely. It would depend on the degree and how much, did they completely just make up the whole paper and just copy somebody else's, or did they take the technique section and just sort of use the words that somebody else used, but for like a standard technique or something? And I think it would vary on the degree of plagiarism. I know that sounds weird, but I mean, the severity of the sanction would need to be appropriate for what occurred.
You mentioned beautifying images and authors not knowing what's appropriate to what degree to go to. So there's a question, to what degree is it acceptable to clean up data?
It's not really acceptable. I mean, I think there's some cases where, example, in JAWS, you might be splicing together lanes, and as long as you put the lines in there to indicate that this was not one continuous gel, but that this is, information spliced together. We also have some wording on our website, which I'm not remembering completely right now, that talks about if you change something, it has to be changed across the whole image and not just parts. Like so if you're changing contrast or doing something like that, it has to be uniform. So there are some things that are okay, so that something is printable or viewable, but it has to be consistent across the whole piece of data. And the wording on our website about that is better. I'm not saying it very well right now, but I think what we're more worried about is that we have a whole generation now that have been playing with digital images since they were probably very young, and they're more used to taking out the red eyes and doing things that a whole generation before them had no ability to do. So it's sort of a different mindset about what you do with the tools that are in front of you. But it has to be done in a way that's not changing the meaning of the data, and it's not applied then it has to be applied consistently.
Okay, we have another question. Could you explain more about partial retractions? For example, is it possible to retract a table or a figure?
I would suggest that you go and look on the NIH website for PubMed. They actually have some guidelines and descriptions of the difference between what would be considered an errata or correction versus a retraction or a partial retraction versus a corrected. I mean, they really go through and explain each type of label and what the difference is. I think if it's just a correction, like if it's just one table, I guess are you removing the table completely or are you actually correcting the table? The thing to be aware of is that a partial retraction will be flagged as a retraction by Medline. Their definition of a retraction is full or partial. So you need to be a little bit careful there. It will be flagged in the indexing as completely retracted. And it's not until someone goes and reads what is written would they know that it's a partial retraction. So I would only use it in a really rare case.
Okay. For a journal that is nonprofit association based, would the cost of an investigation be borne by the society or by the publisher?
Well, again, the investigation isn't really done by the journal. The investigation has to be done by the institution where the authors reside. I'm not sure what costs you're referring to. The staff time involved. I think it's an editorial staff resource that is sort of at least coordinating and communicating with the various individuals. So in that sense, I think it's an editorial cost. But I think you really have to discuss that with your publisher. That's why you need to talk about something like this before it happens. But remember, the investigation into misconduct happens at the institution of the authors or by the funding agency.
Okay, we have another question. How would you proceed if plagiarism is discovered during review and before acceptance? Should this be reported to the author's institution and the funding agency?
I would say yes. Yes, because it's plagiarism. There's actually also, if you go on that Cope website, they have two different flowcharts. One that is for plagiarism that comes out that is in a submitted manuscript, and one is for plagiarism that's in a published article. So you can actually read through the different ways they tell you to handle it. And let's see if I can see what they say about their last act for in a submitted manuscript. It says, consider informing author superior and or person responsible for research governance and or the potential victim or the person who was plagiarized. And in the cases where this is when the author cooperated, but if the author is not cooperating with you, it says you definitely contact the author's institution.
Excellent. We have a few more questions. Someone wants to know, is all image manipulation banned?
That's pretty much the same question that was earlier, and that was, as I said, if you look on our website in our instructions to authors, there are a few things that are allowed, and those are indicated. So as I said, like putting a line in to show that you're splicing gels together, or that you have uniformly, changed the contrast across the whole image. But you can't selectively change contrast.
Okay. If you find out that an author is submitting a manuscript that overlaps with a paper already published in your journal, what would you do?
A paper that overlaps, you mean plagiarizes, or I'm not quite, that question, overlaps in terms of it has a similar result, or if it's just that it's a similar result of something we're already publishing, we would probably not review the paper, and we would send it back to the author so they could get it handled somewhere else quickly. If it's plagiarism, again, you would deal with it as we talked about earlier. If it's a submitted manuscript and we suspect plagiarism, we would notify the authors, get some answers, notify the institution if the author's not cooperating, and take it step by step to determine what exactly was going on.
Okay. Looks like we're down to our last couple of questions. Do you have a limit on how many years or how much time may pass before you no longer retract a paper, for example, for containing duplicative data?
We don't actually have a policy. That's a good question. I think if it was clear-cut evidence, I wouldn't see why you wouldn't retract it, no matter what the time. But granted, the older something gets, the harder it is to really, look into it and to make any kind of fair assessment. So again, it's kind of a hard question to answer without knowing the specifics of the situation. But we do not currently have a policy that says, we won't, look at anything, that was published before 2000 or something like that.
And we had kind of a follow-up comment / question on the who pays for the investigation. I thought that the investigation was purchased from a set organization, for example, a funding agency, so I thought it had to be paid for.
No, that's their job. They're supposed to do that. Hopefully. Maybe that's, They're supposed to, actually, U.S. government funding now requires that an institution has an identified public integrity officer, someone who's responsible to deal with allegations. And usually, if you go on the website of an institution, you can find that person. It takes a little time. Usually, they're maybe in the dean's office or the provost's office or the president's office or the Office of Scientific Research. But usually, you can find at an institution the person who's responsible. And if they're notified of an issue, they have steps that they have to take immediately if they receive, U.S. federal funding from NIH or NSF. So that they have to investigate.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to everybody who chatted in your questions. That was an excellent discussion. It appears to be all the questions we received for today. I want to thank Monica and everyone who attended the webinar. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Hope you gained some valuable information on how to approach ethical issues in publishing. I had a couple of questions about sending out slides and the recording. We will be sending out a brief survey that includes links to both the slides and a video recording of today's session. Please take a few moments to complete the survey. We're always looking for feedback on how we can improve future webinars, and also we are always looking for suggestions for future topics. And don't forget, you can continue the conversation on Facebook, and that concludes our session for today. Thank you.